They said the albino gorilla wouldn't make it through the night, but what the cameras captured just hours before changed everything. The security footage was supposed to be routine, just another quiet night at the wildlife sanctuary on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, where the enclosures stretched across nearly 50 acres of carefully monitored land. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., something unusual began to unfold, something no one on staff could explain at first glance. Because in a dimly lit isolation unit at the far end of the compound, a rare albino gorilla named Ivy lay motionless on a bed of straw, her pale fur almost glowing under the low fluorescent light, her breathing shallow and uneven. The veterinary team had already documented her declining condition earlier that evening, noting that her heart rate had dropped below normal levels and her body temperature was dangerously low. And although they had done everything they could within safe and ethical limits, there was a quiet understanding among them that Ivy might not survive until sunrise. She had been separated from the other gorillas weeks ago, due to her fragile condition and the risk of stress. But that isolation came at a cost no one fully measured at the time, because just across the facility, separated by reinforced steel barriers and thick concrete walls, another gorilla named Marcus stood perfectly still in his enclosure, a massive, aging silverback who had long since faded into the background of daily operations. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't playful, he simply existed, rarely interacting, rarely drawing attention. The staff often described him as forgotten, not out of cruelty, but because he had become predictable, quiet, almost invisible in a place filled with louder, more energetic animals. But that night, Marcus was different. The camera angle showed him standing near the far corner of his enclosure, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed in a direction that didn't seem to make sense at first, because from where he stood, there was no direct line of sight to Ivy's isolation unit, no obvious reason for his attention to be drawn there. And yet he didn't move, not for several minutes. Not even when a distant noise echoed through the compound or when the automated feeding system activated briefly in the adjacent area. He remained locked in place, as if listening to something no human could hear. And then, without warning, he lifted one arm and struck the enclosure wall once. A dull, controlled impact that reverberated through the metal structure. He paused, then struck it again, and then a third time. Each movement deliberate, measured, not frantic, not violent, but purposeful in a way that made the footage unsettling to watch. Because this wasn't random behavior, it was a pattern. And what made it even more unsettling was what happened next. Marcus stopped completely, lowering his arm and returning to stillness, his eyes never shifting from that unseen focal point, as if waiting, as if expecting something to respond, and miles away from any human awareness at that exact moment. In a quiet, sterile room at the edge of the sanctuary, Ivy's chest rose just slightly deeper than before, a small, almost imperceptible change that no one noticed at the time. But that would later become the detail that made everyone question everything they thought they understood about the bond between creatures who had never even been allowed to meet. By early morning, the sanctuary had returned to its usual rhythm, the soft hum of maintenance vehicles moving along gravel paths, the distant calls of birds echoing across the property, and the quiet routine of keepers beginning their rounds just after 6 a.m. But inside the medical wing, the atmosphere felt noticeably heavier. As Doctor Rachel Sloan reviewed Ivy's overnight vitals on a tablet screen, her expression tightening with concern, because although there had been a slight, almost unexplainable stabilization in Ivy's breathing around 2 o'clock, her overall condition remained critical. Her heart rate was still fluctuating below safe levels, and her body temperature had only risen by a fraction of a degree, not enough to be considered recovery, just enough to raise questions. Questions that Doctor Sloan could not immediately answer using standard medical explanations. And as she stood there beside the enclosure, watching Ivy's chest rise and fall in slow, fragile intervals, Ethan Cole stepped in quietly behind her, holding a printed log from the overnight security feed, his brow furrowed as he flipped to a highlighted section. "You need to see this," he said, keeping his voice low, careful not to disturb the already tense silence. And when Doctor Sloan turned to him, he pointed to the timestamps between 2:15 and 2:20 a.m., explaining that there had been unusual activity recorded in Marcus's enclosure, something repetitive, something deliberate, and at first, Doctor Sloan assumed it was just another case of stress behavior, something not uncommon in older gorillas, especially those who had spent years in controlled environments. But as Ethan described the exact timing, the three distinct impacts against the enclosure wall, followed by complete stillness, her expression shifted slightly, because the timing aligned almost exactly with the brief stabilization in Ivy's vitals. A coincidence that neither of them wanted to overinterpret, but neither could ignore, and without saying much more, they moved together toward the control room, where the overnight footage was already queued up, the screen flickering softly as Ethan pressed play, and once again, they watched Marcus standing in that same rigid posture, his gaze fixed, his movements precise. One strike, then another, then a third, each spaced just seconds apart. And then nothing, just silence, just waiting, and as the footage continued, Doctor Sloan leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the subtle details, the way Marcus's breathing slowed afterward, the way his shoulders relaxed, not like an animal in distress, but like one that had completed an intentional act. And what unsettled her most was not the action itself, but the absence of randomness. Because animals in stress did not usually behave with that level of measured repetition. And as the clip ended, Ethan glanced at her, searching for a clinical explanation, but she did not offer one right away. Instead, she turned back toward the hallway that led to Ivy's enclosure, her mind connecting fragments that did not yet form a complete picture. And when they returned to the isolation unit, something small but undeniable had changed. Ivy's breathing, while still weak, was slightly more consistent than it had been just an hour earlier, her chest rising in a steadier rhythm. And although it was far from recovery, it was enough to shift the tone in the room from resignation to cautious attention. And standing there, just a few feet away, Doctor Sloan placed a hand lightly against the glass, not expecting a response, but noticing something that made her pause. Ivy's fingers twitched, just slightly, a movement so subtle it could have been dismissed, but in that moment, it felt like a signal, not of strength, but of connection, something reaching just beyond what they could measure. And across the sanctuary, in his enclosure, Marcus had returned to stillness once again, but this time, there was a quiet alertness in the way he held himself, as if he were waiting for something more to happen, something that no one had yet allowed to unfold. By late morning, the quiet tension inside the sanctuary had shifted into something more uneasy, something that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence anymore. Because around 10:32 a.m., as Doctor Rachel Sloan reviewed another round of Ivy's vitals, she noticed a pattern that made her pause. Ivy's heart rate, which had been unstable for days, suddenly showed brief moments of rhythm, not strong, not sustained, but noticeably more organized than before. And what made it more unsettling was the timing, because Ethan Cole, who had continued monitoring the security feeds out of growing curiosity, walked into the room with a second report, this time from earlier that morning. "It happened again," he said quietly, placing the printed still frames on the table. And when Doctor Sloan looked down, she saw the timestamps lined up once more. Marcus, standing in the same position, repeating the same sequence. 3 controlled strikes against the enclosure wall, followed by complete stillness. And once again, within minutes, Ivy's vitals showed a subtle response. And now it was no longer just an isolated event. It was a pattern, something consistent enough to raise concern. Not just curiosity, because in clinical terms, there was no direct explanation for how a gorilla housed in a separate enclosure over 100 yards away, with multiple structural barriers in between, could have any measurable influence on Ivy's physical state. And yet the data suggested otherwise, and that was what made the situation so difficult to process, because it challenged the very boundaries they relied on to manage and understand animal behavior. And as the two of them stood there, in silence, reviewing the overlapping timelines, Ethan spoke again. "He only does it when she gets worse." And that observation lingered in the air longer than either of them expected, because it implied something more than instinct, something more than random stress behavior. It suggested awareness. And as they replayed the footage once more, this time slowing it down frame by frame, Doctor Sloan began to notice details she had missed before, the way Marcus adjusted his posture before each movement, the way he seemed to pause as if listening, as if responding to something distant and faint, something beyond human perception, and then came the realization that shifted everything. The spacing between each strike was nearly identical each time, measured down to the second, not erratic, not emotional, but controlled, almost like a signal. And suddenly the question was no longer whether Marcus was reacting, but what exactly he was trying to communicate, and whether Ivy was somehow receiving it. And back in the isolation unit, Ivy's condition remained fragile, but there was a new detail that none of them could ignore. Her eyes, which had remained closed for nearly 24 hours, flickered briefly, just enough to suggest a response. And although she did not fully awaken, the movement was enough to draw immediate attention from the medical team, because it broke the pattern of decline they had been documenting. And as one of the assistants quietly adjusted the monitoring equipment, Doctor Sloan stood still, her mind racing through possibilities that did not fit into standard medical frameworks. Because if this was not purely physical, if something else was influencing Ivy's condition, then the entire approach they were using might be incomplete. And across the sanctuary, Marcus had once again returned to stillness. But this time, he did not step away from the wall. He remained close to it, his head slightly tilted, his breathing calm, as if waiting for a response that only he could recognize. And for the first time since this began, the staff could no longer look at his behavior and label it as random, because the pattern was too precise, too intentional. And whatever was happening between these two animals, separated by distance and design, was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like something they had never planned for, something they were not yet prepared to understand. By early afternoon, the quiet concern that had been building among the staff finally began to shift into something more urgent, because patterns that could once be dismissed as coincidence were now repeating with a consistency that no one could ignore. And inside the observation room, Doctor Rachel Sloan stood with her arms crossed, watching the live feed from Marcus's enclosure while Ethan Cole adjusted the camera angle to get a clearer view. And once again, right on schedule, Marcus moved toward the same section of the wall, his posture calm but focused, his breathing steady, and without hesitation, he lifted his arm and struck the surface once, then paused, then again, and then a third time, each impact spaced with near-perfect precision. And what followed was no longer surprising, but it was no less unsettling, because within minutes, the monitoring system beside Ivy's enclosure began to reflect a subtle but undeniable response, her heart rate lifting slightly, her breathing becoming more even. And although the changes were small, they were now impossible to separate from the pattern they had observed multiple times throughout the day. And this was the moment when the discussion shifted from observation to decision, because allowing this to continue without intervention meant accepting something they did not fully understand. But stopping it could mean interrupting the only response Ivy had shown in over 24 hours, and that uncertainty weighed heavily in the room as Doctor Sloan finally spoke, her voice measured but firm. "We need to test this," she said, not as a theory, but as a necessary step, and Ethan nodded, already anticipating what she meant, because the only way to understand whether Marcus was truly influencing Ivy's condition was to interrupt the pattern and observe the outcome. And so, within the next 30 minutes, they made a controlled adjustment, not drastic, not harmful, but enough to create a variable. They temporarily redirected Marcus away from the wall by introducing a mild environmental change in his enclosure, something designed to shift his focus without causing distress. And for the first time since the pattern began, Marcus did not perform the sequence. He moved to a different part of the enclosure, engaging briefly with the new object. And as the minutes passed, the room grew quiet, all eyes shifting back to Ivy's vitals, waiting, measuring. And then it happened, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Her heart rate began to lose its rhythm again, dipping lower, her breathing becoming irregular, the fragile stability they had observed slipping away. And no one spoke, because the implication was already clear. And after nearly 15 minutes, Marcus returned to the wall on his own, as if the interruption had not erased whatever internal signal he was following. And once again, he performed the same sequence, 3 measured strikes, followed by stillness, and almost immediately after, Ivy's vitals responded again, not fully recovering, but stabilizing just enough to mirror what they had seen before. And this time, the silence in the room carried a different weight, because it was no longer just observation, It was confirmation of a connection they could not yet explain, and Doctor Sloan exhaled slowly, her mind shifting from skepticism to something closer to cautious acceptance. Because whatever was happening here was not random, it was not instinct in its simplest form. It was something more complex, something that suggested Marcus was not just reacting, but responding with intention. And across the sanctuary, Marcus stood quietly once more, his posture relaxed but alert, as if aware that what he was doing mattered, as if he could sense the effect even without seeing it. And for the first time, the staff began to consider a possibility that had never been part of their protocols, that perhaps the isolation they had imposed to protect Ivy was not entirely helping her, and that somewhere beyond the limits of their measurements, Marcus was reaching her in a way they had never anticipated. As the afternoon light stretched across the sanctuary, casting long shadows through the reinforced glass panels, the atmosphere inside the control room had shifted from uncertainty to a quiet, almost reverent focus, because what they were witnessing no longer felt like an anomaly. It felt like a message they had not yet learned how to interpret, and Doctor Rachel Sloan stood beside the monitoring station, her eyes moving between Ivy's vitals and the live feed of Marcus, her mind no longer asking whether there was a connection, but what kind of connection this truly was. And it was in that moment, as she reviewed the archived behavioral records stored in the system, that a detail surfaced, something buried in reports from years earlier, something that had never seemed important until now. Because Marcus had not always been the silent, overlooked presence he had become, there had been a time, nearly 8 years ago, when he had displayed a very different pattern of behavior, one that had puzzled staff at the time but was eventually dismissed when no immediate explanation was found. And as she pulled up the old footage, the room grew still again, because what appeared on the screen was a much younger Marcus, positioned near a different enclosure, performing a sequence that looked strikingly familiar: 3 measured taps against a surface, followed by stillness, repeated over and over again, not in agitation, but in what now seemed like intention. And standing on the other side of that enclosure in the archived footage was a smaller gorilla, weak, barely moving, recovering from an illness that had nearly taken its life. And as the clip continued, the timestamps revealed something that had gone unnoticed back then. Each time Marcus performed the sequence, the smaller gorilla showed a slight response, a shift in posture, a deeper breath, a subtle sign of recovery. And yet, at the time, it had been written off as coincidence, because no one had been looking for a connection, no one had thought to question it. And now, standing in the present, Doctor Sloan felt the weight of that oversight settle in, because the pattern was too similar to ignore. And as she turned to Ethan, her voice carried a new clarity. "He has done this before," she said, not as speculation, but as realization. And Ethan stared at the screen, processing what that meant, because it suggested that Marcus was not just reacting to Ivy's condition, he was repeating something he had learned, something he understood on a level they had never fully recognized. And suddenly, the idea of coincidence disappeared completely, replaced by something far more profound. Because this was no longer about random behavior, this was about memory, about experience, about a form of communication that did not rely on language but on rhythm, presence, and connection. And back in the isolation unit, Ivy's condition remained fragile, but there was a new detail that made the room feel different. Her fingers, which had only twitched once before, now moved again, slightly more pronounced, curling faintly against the straw beneath her. And although it was still a small change, it carried a sense of direction, as if something inside her was responding, not just physically, but instinctively. And across the sanctuary, Marcus remained near the wall, no longer striking it repeatedly, but staying close, his body angled toward the direction of Ivy's enclosure, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering, as if he understood that what he had started could not be interrupted. And for the first time, the staff began to see him not as a forgotten animal in the background, but as something else entirely, something they had never planned for, something that did not fit within their protocols. Because whatever Marcus was doing, it was not something they had taught him, it was something he carried within him, something that now might be the only thing standing between Ivy and the outcome they had all feared. By the time the sun began to lower over the sanctuary, casting a warm amber glow across the enclosures, The decision that had once seemed unthinkable was now the only logical step left, because every piece of evidence, every pattern, every subtle response pointed in the same direction, and inside the observation room. Doctor Rachel Sloane stood with a steady but cautious expression as she looked at Ethan Cole and the rest of the small team gathered around. "We cannot keep them separated anymore," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone pause, because the isolation protocol had been designed to protect Ivy, to reduce stress, to give her body the best chance to recover. But now it was becoming clear that something essential had been missing from that equation, something no medical chart had accounted for, and Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the risk. Because introducing another gorilla into close proximity, especially one as large and unpredictable as Marcus, was not a standard procedure, but neither was what they had been witnessing all day, and after a brief but focused discussion, they agreed on a controlled approach, not immediate physical contact, but a gradual reduction of distance, something that would allow observation without overwhelming Ivy's already fragile state. And within the next hour, the team carefully prepared the adjacent enclosure, ensuring that every safety measure was in place, every barrier secure, every monitoring device active. And as the transition began, Marcus was guided toward the connecting section, not forced, not rushed, but allowed to move at his own pace. And what surprised everyone was how calmly he responded. There was no resistance, no confusion, just a quiet readiness, as if he understood where he was being led. And when he reached the boundary closest to Ivy's isolation unit, he stopped on his own, positioning himself near the barrier, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze fixed forward. And inside the isolation space, Ivy remained lying on the straw, her breathing still shallow, her movements minimal, but as the barrier between them was adjusted to allow sound and subtle vibrations to pass through more clearly, something changed almost immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably enough to draw every eye in the room. Marcus lowered himself slowly to the ground, mirroring Ivy's position, his massive frame settling with a surprising gentleness. And then, without striking the wall, without repeating the earlier pattern, he extended his arm toward the barrier, his hand resting lightly against it. And for a moment, nothing happened, just silence, just the quiet hum of the monitoring equipment. And then Ivy's fingers moved again, this time more distinctly, curling slightly as if responding to something beyond the physical space between them. And Doctor Sloane stepped closer to the glass, her breath held as she watched the monitors. Ivy's heart rate lifted, just a few beats per minute. Her breathing deepened slightly, not enough to signal recovery, but enough to confirm what they had begun to suspect, that the presence of Marcus, even without direct contact, was creating a measurable effect. And across the barrier, Marcus remained completely still, his hand unmoving, his posture calm, as if maintaining a connection that did not require motion. And in that moment, the room felt different. Not tense, not uncertain, but focused in a way that suggested they were witnessing something rare, something that existed outside the boundaries of their usual understanding. And for the first time since Ivy had been placed in isolation, there was a quiet shift in expectation, not toward certainty, but toward possibility. Because whatever Marcus was doing, whatever instinct or memory guided him, it was no longer something happening at a distance. It was now present, immediate, and undeniably connected to the fragile life lying just a few feet away. As the evening settled over the sanctuary and the sky shifted into deeper shades of blue, the stillness between the two enclosures carried a quiet intensity that no one in the room could ignore, because what had begun as a cautious experiment was now unfolding into something far more emotional than any of them had anticipated. And inside the observation room, no one spoke. For several minutes as they watched the live feed, Marcus remained seated near the barrier, his hand still resting against it, his posture unwavering, his presence calm in a way that felt almost deliberate. And just a few feet away, Ivy lay where she had been for hours, but something about her no longer felt the same. Her breathing, while still fragile, had become more consistent, each rise and fall of her chest slightly deeper than before. And then, slowly, almost as if responding to an invisible signal, her head shifted just a fraction, a movement so small it would have been easy to miss, but not today, not in this moment, because every detail mattered, And Ethan Cole leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen, his voice barely above a whisper as he said, "She is responding." And Doctor Rachel Sloan did not answer right away, because what she was seeing required more than confirmation. It required acceptance of something she had never been trained to recognize. And as the seconds passed, Ivy's fingers moved again, this time not just a twitch, but a slow, deliberate motion, curling slightly toward the barrier, toward the place where Marcus remained. And that was when something shifted in the room, not in the data, not in the monitors, but in the people watching, because what they were witnessing no longer felt clinical, it felt personal. It felt like connection, and across the barrier, Marcus adjusted his position just slightly, not pulling away, not pressing harder, but aligning himself more directly with Ivy's movement, as if he could sense the change without needing to see it. And then, in a moment that none of them would forget, Ivy's eyes opened, not fully, not with strength, but enough to reveal awareness, enough to break the stillness that had surrounded her for so long. And the reaction in the room was immediate but quiet. No one shouted, no one moved suddenly. But there was a collective shift, a release of tension that had been building for hours, because this was the first clear sign that Ivy was not just surviving. She was returning, and Doctor Sloan felt her throat tighten slightly as she stepped closer to the glass, her voice softer now, almost reflective as she spoke. "We thought isolation would protect her," she said, more to herself than anyone else. But it might have been the one thing holding her back. And Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes still on the screen, because the realization was difficult but undeniable, that in trying to control every variable, they had overlooked something fundamental, something that could not be measured in charts or predicted by protocol. And as Ivy's breathing continued to steady, Marcus remained exactly where he was, his presence constant, his hands still resting against the barrier, not demanding attention, not reacting outwardly, but simply being there. And in that quiet, steady presence, there was a sense of purpose that no one could explain, because whatever Marcus was doing, whatever instinct or memory guided him, it was no longer something hidden or misunderstood. It was visible now, undeniable, and deeply human in a way that made the room fall silent once again, not out of confusion this time, but out of respect for something they were only just beginning to understand. The hours that followed did not feel like time passing in any ordinary sense, because inside the sanctuary, everything had slowed into careful observation, every movement, every breath, every subtle change carrying a weight that no one dared to interrupt. And as night settled fully outside, the lights inside the enclosures remained soft and steady, casting a calm glow over both Ivy and Marcus, who had not moved far from their positions for what felt like an eternity. And yet neither appeared restless, neither showed signs of fatigue in the way the staff might have expected, because whatever connection had formed between them seemed to hold its own rhythm, independent of the usual patterns of behavior. And inside the observation room, Doctor Rachel Sloan continued to monitor Ivy's vitals with a focus that bordered on disbelief, because for the first time since Ivy had been placed under critical watch, her readings were no longer declining. They were stabilizing, not dramatically, not in a way that suggested immediate recovery, but in a steady, consistent pattern that could not be ignored. Her heart rate had risen into a safer range, her breathing had deepened, and even her body temperature had increased by nearly 1 degree Fahrenheit. A small change by standard measures, but in this context, it was significant, it was progress. And Ethan Cole stood nearby, arms resting against the console, watching both the data and the live feed. His expression quieter now, less analytical, more reflective, because the longer he observed, the harder it became to separate what he was seeing from something deeply emotional, something that went beyond training and protocols. And as the night continued, Ivy began to show more signs of awareness, her eyes opening slightly longer this time, her head shifting with more intention, and at one point, she turned just enough to face the barrier more directly, as if aligning herself with Marcus's presence. And in response, Marcus adjusted as well, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a slow, deliberate movement that mirrored her position, his hand remaining near the barrier, his posture calm and grounded. And what stood out most was the absence of any outward display. There was no agitation, no vocalization, just quiet consistency. as if he understood that stillness itself was part of what Ivy needed. And as the hours passed, the staff began to notice something else, something even more subtle but deeply meaningful. Ivy was no longer just reacting. She was initiating small movements on her own, her fingers curling slightly before Marcus moved, her breathing deepening even in the moments between his shifts, suggesting that whatever connection had formed was no longer dependent on constant input. It had become internal, something her body was beginning to hold on to, and Doctor Sloan felt a shift within herself as well, because everything she had been trained to rely on, every protocol designed to ensure safety and recovery, had not accounted for this, had not prepared her for the possibility that presence, connection, and something as simple as proximity could influence recovery in a way that no medication alone could achieve. And as she looked from the monitors to the two animals separated by only a thin barrier, she realized that what they were witnessing was not just an unusual case. It was a reminder of something more fundamental, something that had been overlooked in the pursuit of control. And across the enclosure, Marcus remained steady, his breathing slow, his posture relaxed. But there was a quiet awareness in the way he remained connected, as if he could sense that Ivy was no longer fading, that she was holding on. And for the first time since this began, the fear that had filled the room at the start of the day had been replaced by something else, something quieter but far more powerful, a sense that what they were witnessing was not just recovery, but the beginning of something they had not fully understood until now. By the time the first light of morning began to break across the horizon, casting a pale golden glow over the sanctuary, the atmosphere inside the observation room had changed completely from what it had been just 24 hours earlier, because where there had once been quiet concern and measured expectations, there was now a sense of cautious hope, something steady and real. And as Doctor Rachel Sloan reviewed the latest readings on Ivy's monitor, she allowed herself, for the first time, to exhale without hesitation, because Ivy's vitals were no longer hovering at the edge of decline. They had stabilized within a range that suggested resilience. Her heart rate had maintained a consistent rhythm through the night. Her breathing was deeper, more regular, and her body temperature had risen another degree, bringing her closer to a safe threshold. And perhaps most importantly, she was no longer lying completely still. Her movements, though still gentle and limited, carried intention. Small shifts of her head, subtle adjustments of her arms, each one signaling that her body was no longer simply enduring. It was beginning to recover. And just beyond the barrier, Marcus remained where he had been for hours, his presence unchanged, his posture calm and grounded. And when Ivy moved, he responded in kind, not immediately, not reactively, but in a way that felt connected, as if he understood the rhythm she was finding and chose to stay aligned with it. And Ethan Cole stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a quiet sense of disbelief that had softened into something deeper, something more reflective, because everything they had observed over the past day had challenged the assumptions they had relied on for years, and yet the evidence was right in front of them, undeniable and steady. And as the morning routine began across the sanctuary, with other staff members arriving and the distant sounds of activity returning to the grounds, the small group inside the observation room remained focused on the two animals who had, in their own way, rewritten the outcome of what had once seemed certain. And as the hours passed, Ivy's progress continued, not rapidly, not in a way that suggested a sudden transformation, but in a steady, grounded way that felt sustainable, and eventually, under careful supervision, the barrier between the two enclosures was adjusted slightly more, allowing a closer proximity while still maintaining safety. And Marcus responded with the same calm consistency he had shown all along, remaining close, lowering himself once again to match Ivy's position, his presence quiet and unwavering. And when Ivy turned her head more fully toward him, her eyes open and aware, there was a moment that no one in the room could fully describe, because it was not dramatic, it was not loud, it was simply real, a recognition, a connection that did not need to be explained to be understood. And Doctor Sloan felt a quiet shift within herself as she watched, because she knew that everything they had witnessed would stay with them long after this moment passed, not just as a case study or an unusual event, but as a reminder that not everything that matters can be measured or controlled, that sometimes the most important part of healing comes from something deeper, something